Akedah Project.
We invite you to join.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
I'm working on a book right now about the centrality of love in Jewish theology and in Jewish spirituality and Jewish ethics, really. And I guess a question that bothers, to say the least, anyone who encounters this text is, how could a good God, a loving God, ask what seems like a monstrous ask of Abraham? And one interpretation that I think is interesting, I don't think it's what Genesis had in mind, but I think it's an interesting moment in the history of Jewish thought, is that Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, who was the first chief rabbi of Palestine, suggests that what God is trying to do in that moment is elicit from Abraham all of the passion that he sees pagans and idolaters have. I want you to love me so much that you would do anything for me. And once you're willing to do anything for me, let me just tell you, I would never ask you to do something that's unethical. Do not touch that child. And in other words, he wants Abraham to have the passion of an idolater and the ethics of a monotheist. And that's how Kook can make sense both of the beginning of the story, where God issues a command, and the end of the story, where God stays Abraham's hand. And I think that that's just a kind of an interesting lens. What that does is offer an alternative. You know, every year, 1,000 liberal sermons are launched about how Abraham should have said no to God. That's a position that Immanuel Kant most famously advocated. He should have said, you know, that he's my son, I know, and that I have obligations to him, I know, but that the voice commanding me is you, I don't actually know, so I cannot allow myself to do what you're saying. The Kook approach, in contrast, says, no, God didn't do the wrong thing when God asked him. God was setting him up to learn a lesson about the kind of things God does and doesn't ask for. In other words, it allows the story to be read more wholly on its own terms. Because I think one of the challenges of kind of the liberal reading of the text, to the extent that you really value reading the text closely, is that there's nothing in the text to suggest that Abraham failed. So what Kook does is enable you to find a reading where Abraham succeeds. And yet, the lesson that he then learns is, never do something like this. Never allow yourself to do this kind of thing. And that is of a piece with Kook's whole philosophy. One of the things that Rav Kook says that I think is very moving is that any time a person becomes religious and begins to think that something that he used to know was morally forbidden, he now thinks is permitted to him, he has to know that that is yirah psula, that is totally unacceptable fear of God. Religion never allows you to do what you knew was morally prohibited before you engage with religion. That is quite a statement to make. I've often said in public that if I could teach the religious leaders of the world one thing, one Jewish text, it might just be that paragraph from Rav Kook. Do not allow religion to be a form of moral license. It is meant to be quite the opposite. It is a moment in which Abraham, in many ways, Abraham serves as a kind of paradigm of faith, a paragon of faith for Jews who follow him. And in that sense, Abraham has already been taught, we don't do that. We muster the same kind of passion, but we direct that specifically in the direction of the ethical rather than to permit what's unethical. I think that that's basically right. One of the ways in which the Akedah has been used in modern Jewish culture, and it's a way that I think is actually quite damaging, is that it is used to defend areas of halakha that appear to be immoral, are defended essentially by an invocation of the Akedah. You find that in different ways, I think, both in the writings of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik and in the Israeli philosopher Yeshayahu Leibowitz. In a way, the Akedah becomes a kind of rearguard action against modern moral critique of tradition. Oh, you don't find this moral? Well, after all, Abraham was asked to sacrifice his morality. Now, I think that's dangerous for two reasons. Number one, I don't think it's a very good reading of the Akedah, because as strange as this may sound, I don't think that in biblical times, the idea of sacrificing your child to God struck people as immoral. The challenge of the Akedah, as I understand it, biblically speaking, not from our perspective, obviously, but biblically speaking, is that it's just so impossibly hard. I don't think that Genesis thinks that the problem is that Abraham has been asked to sacrifice his morality. At the risk of facing how big the gap is on certain issues between us and the biblical text, I don't think the text is about immorality at all. The text is about God making a demand that's just so difficult. So in other words, the notion that the Akedah is about the sacrifice of morality strikes me as wildly anachronistic. And in a funny way, ironically, the Jewish thinkers who use it that way are actually reading Kierkegaard and not reading Genesis. They're actually reading a particular interpretation of the Akedah, and I think it's wrong. You could say there's an interesting trade-off. On the one hand, what we gain is you can't use the Akedah in this really damaging way. What we lose is that the gap between our moral perception and the biblical text's moral perception becomes very, very vast. What do you mean they didn't think sacrificing your child was necessarily immoral? How could that be? So we solve one problem and open up another. That's the kind of trade-off that we on some level make. The second reason that invoking the Akedah in this way is so dangerous is that very often when people invoke the Akedah in modern halachic, modern Jewish legal reasoning, it is other people they are demanding make a sacrifice and not themselves. So when a rabbi says to a young gay man, there is no way for you to have a partner according to Jewish law, you are fated to live a life of loneliness, that's an Akedah. Don't make an Akedah out of someone else's life. That strikes me as particularly outrageous. You want to interpret your own life as an Akedah in some way, you're always within your rights. It's the same way I don't believe in theologizing other people's pain. If you tell me you got this disease for some reason that you believe you got it, okay, you're allowed to interpret your own life. Don't tell me while I'm suffering. Don't explain my life to me in theological terms. That being Job's friend, right? That's failing. I think the same thing is true. If you want to say, look, this is a burden I have to carry because God has placed it on me, if that's how you experience the world, so great, because unto hate, go for it. But if you want to then say to me, you are carrying this burden because God has put it on you, don't theologize my life into an Akedah. You don't have the right to do that. And you don't have the right not to work harder to make my life livable. Well, one thing that I have been thinking about recently that comes at this from a very perhaps surprising angle is the relationship between the Akedah and the story of Solomon and the two women who claim that the baby is theirs. That story in the beginning of the book of 1 Kings, just to remind people, which is a story, a folktale that exists in various cultures, that there are two women, each of whom has a baby. One of the babies dies. Both women claim that the baby who's still alive is theirs. And Solomon famously says, okay, let's cut the baby in half. And the woman who says, please, whatever you do, don't kill the baby, that's the mother. That story is very strange on so many different levels, right? As if someone who's not the mother would say, okay, fine, go ahead, cut the baby in half. Great John Mulaney skit about this, by the way. Great, amazing reading of the story. But anyway, what I find interesting about the relationship between the Akedah and that story is that in both instances, it's the parent who's willing to give up the child who ends up getting the child after all. And I've been really wrestling with what that means. What does it mean to borrow a phrase from the rock band 38 Special, to hold on loosely rather than holding on too tightly? And what might we learn about the passionate connections that we have? To be honest, I find this very difficult because as someone who's seen a lot and been through a lot of trauma in my life, I want to hold my kids as tightly as I possibly can. And yet I'm also aware that at a certain point, I'm going to have to loosen my grip so that they can become who they are. So I'm just sort of thinking about that as a potential intertext, these two moments when parents say, okay, I surrender, and then they get back what they give up. The question really, it seems to me, cuts in two ways. On the one hand, are there ways in which we harm our children for our callings that we should stop? And are there situations where our children's suffering in the name of their parents' calling is actually okay? I remember, okay is maybe not the word, but an acceptable sacrifice. I remember reading something years ago about a doctor who spent most of his life building clinics in the third world, in the developing world. And one of the things that the article mentioned is his kids never saw him growing up. And the issue in the article was that his colleagues and his friends couldn't bring themselves to judge him because they kept saying, it's just unbelievable how many lives he saved. And, are there times? Now, of course, if I was his kid, I might have a different response. I might say, well, wait a minute, he was my father. I wanted time with him. I don't know. I think what I like about this interpretation is that it opens up a question more than it answers it. One of the things that I never tire of saying is that religion at its best gives us better language for our questions rather than offering us two pat solutions. If we're reading the text as a story about how sometimes our children pay the price for our own passions and commitments, perhaps even for our best passions and commitments. It's one thing to say my child paid a price for my golf habit. It's another thing to say my child paid a price because I spent my life saving lives in an ER, right? And if that's the case, so how do we wrestle with trade-offs in life? I mean, so much of life is about fundamentally accepting trade-offs that we wish we didn't have to accept. And maybe this story can be read as in part about that. I also want to add, something, another reading of this that I think is interesting, that again, I'm not sure in the text itself what it means, but I think it's hard to read the text without noticing this, is that this moment, which on one level, I think Genesis sees as Abraham, triumphing religiously and doing what God asks of him. On another level, his family is utterly devastated as a result. Sarah dies, and Abraham and Isaac, to the best of my recollection, never exchange another word again in the biblical text. Right? It's quite remarkable, right? And there again, on the reading that you're proposing, the reading that we're considering here about, maybe it's about the costs that people pay. Isn't it an interesting story to consider? What if we say that Abraham succeeded in the test and his family suffered immensely? Right? I don't mean that obviously in some kind of crude or callous way, but what if that's part of what the Torah is asking us to consider? Are there times when family pays price that, I don't know, we see as a kind of tragic necessity? I have wondered a lot whether the narrator wants us to question Abraham based on the result. One of the things I wrote about in the Heart of Torah that I had a bunch of Bible scholars kind of write to me to argue with me about was I proposed that it was really interesting that the story of the Akedah begins with Abraham and Isaac, and we're explicitly told ascending the mountain together. But when the story ends, we hear about Abraham returning home alone. And there's an astonishingly beautiful midrash that says that where Isaac went after the Akedah is to go find Hagar and bring her home. And to say to Abraham, you can't throw people out of your house. You can't just walk away from people who are your family. You can't do that. And so that when Sarah dies, Abraham marries Hagar. When the text tells us that Abraham married Keturah, a woman named Keturah, the sages tell us he married Hagar. And I just found that to be very, very beautiful, that the idea that this is my interpretation of that midrash, that essentially Isaac now understands Hagar's suffering in a way that he didn't before. He understands what it feels like to be abandoned by Abraham and to be left to his own fate. And he learns compassion from that. And rather than sort of see himself as in a zero-sum competition with Hagar and Ishmael for Abraham's love, he actually wants Abraham to love them. Now, again, is that the plain sense of the biblical text? I don't know. I'm not sure how much it matters. I was reading a novel recently in which one character who's very pious, as a devout Christian, says to the other, God never gives us a burden that's too big for us to handle. And the other character responds, this is in Ann Tyler's book, A Spool of Blue Thread. The other character responds, what are you talking about? There's people everywhere you turn who are utterly destroyed by the suffering they've had to face. What do you mean God never gives us a burden that's too big for us to handle? And I wonder about this story. Does Isaac ever recover? Isaac never seems to recover his sense of agency. He goes through the rest of his life passive and almost hapless. And Sarah dies. And I guess I am very resistant, and this is not about reading the biblical text. This is about being a theologian, and more than that, even a pastor. I just am not willing to theologize other people's pain. I'm not willing to ever say about any concrete situation, maybe God gave you this so that, you would learn X, Y, or Z. What I think is far more powerful is for someone to say for themselves, this has happened to me. What am I supposed to learn from that? In my own struggles as an adult with chronic illness, one of the things that I have thought about a lot, I would never claim, I don't believe it. Second of all, I wouldn't say it even if I did. I think, God gave me an illness that I would learn compassion. But what I do say to myself all the time is, given that I have this illness, how can I use it to teach me love? How can I use it to let me learn compassion? I think it's very different. It's about religion, I think, is on much better ground when it offers a response rather than some kind of metaphysical explanation. Metaphysical explanations are A, not convincing, and B, I think often offensive to the person that they're offered to. So in other words, in this situation, I might say to Isaac, I don't know why God said that to Abraham. But I do know that one discussion that might be worth having here is, what do you learn from this? And that's again why I find that the story of Isaac going to find Hagar so moving, is that he actually derives something. He chooses to learn compassion. At least this is the rabbinic reading of the story, obviously, not the story itself, the biblical story. He chooses to learn love and compassion from this moment of horror in his life.